Hello guys, welcome back to another tutorial on complete .NET Web APIs. So in this tutorial, I'll be showing you about authorization. So in the last couple of tutorials, we went through authentication of the APIs and securely accessing the API endpoints. This tutorial, we'll take it a notch further and we'll try to authorize the endpoints based on permissions. So the simplest way we can do it is by using the roles. Okay, so let's go ahead and try to run the application. So let's run our API. And let's try to access the Swagger document. So as we've seen in the previous tutorials, we have the company's controller, get company's endpoint here. And if we try to access it directly, since we have authentication in place now, it will give us 401, which is unauthorized. And so once we log in, so let's first register a user. So I'll call it John. johndoe@myorg.com, and let's give it a password, India@1234. And now the user is registered. So once the user is registered, let's now log in so that we can get the access token. So we log in as john.doe@myorg.com, India@1234. Now, once we log in, we should get a JWT access token. So now we'll authorize the endpoints by using bearer. Okay. So now if we try to access the company's endpoint, we should get the data correctly. Okay. But now let's go ahead and add roles to that particular endpoint. So we are in the company's controller. And here what we'll do is we'll just give it authorize. And if you see here, roles, and we'll say, just give it a role name called admin. Okay. And now let's run it again. So what we've done is the get company's endpoint, we have allowed it only to the roles which are admin. Okay. So now let's run the API and check. So if we run it first without authentication, as usual, we should be thrown with 401. That's fine. But now let's try to authenticate it. Let's log in back again. chen.do@myorg.com, and let's enter the password, India@1234. So once we get the JWT token, let's go ahead and authorize. Okay. Now we've authenticated it. And now if we try to run the company's endpoint, now you see it's giving us 403 forbidden. So that is because we have a role called admin in place now for that particular endpoint. But how would we able to access that? So to do that, when we are generating the token in the claims, we need to add this particular role. So if we go to auth token service, when we are generating the token for a particular user, we are setting some claims like user ID, email. Similarly, what we can do is you can add a new claim to the token. Let's call it claim types dot role, and now we give it the admin role. So when the user is logging in, when we are generating the token for it, in the token we are telling the token that this particular user is an admin. So let's add the admin claim to it. So when it will try to validate, it should run the endpoint. So now if we try to run the endpoint, even though we have the role admin for that particular endpoint, and let's run and check if it is working fine now. Okay, so let's access endpoints API. So again, we'll try to access it before authentication. Should give us 401. Now let's try to authenticate. Let's log in back again. John.doe at myorg.com. India @1234. Okay, so now we have the JWT token. Before authenticating it, let's just head to jwt.io and let's check the payload of the token, what it contains. So if you check the decoded token, it will have a new claim called admin, which is the role. So role claim, along with the email and subject, it will have the role claim. So now if we try to authorize it, and now let's go ahead and run the company's endpoint. So now if you see, we are able to access the data perfectly, even though that particular endpoint is accessible only to admins. You'll be able to access it. Okay. So this is how you give roles or add for the authorization to the endpoints. But this approach is useful if your application is smaller or it does not have too many roles and permissions. But if you have a bit larger application where you have a lot of roles and permission structure, so in that case, we'll use another approach. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll have an entire structure of roles and permissions in the database. Okay. And then use uh, to add the permissions to the claims as you just seen this, and then we'll try to authenticate it. For that, I've already created the database structure. I'll just show it to you. So if we just go to organization.db and we go to the tables, we've created some new tables. So if you see, I have created a table called roles, TBL roles, which has ID, name, ID and name, and the paging order and is deleted. So this is the role table. Then we have permission table. So again, permission will have ID and name. And then we have a mapping table between roles and permissions, which is TBL role permissions. And then we have another mapping table between user and role. So TBL user roles, which has the user role and role ID. Okay. Now, also in the initialization script, what I've done is I have created some created some roles and permissions. So if you see, TBL roles table contains three roles: admin, user, and visitor. Then we have five permissions in the TBL permissions table, that is read, list, write, modify, and delete. And then in the mapping table, I've mapped the roles to particular permissions. So the admin role has all 5 permissions. The user role has only 3 permissions, that is read, list, and modify. And the visitor role has only 1 permission, that is read permission. Okay. So now what we'll do is I will publish this database. So once we publish this, we'll get this data seeded in the database. So I'll just say load profile and publish the database. So once this is published, we'll have a look at the database. I've also created the domain classes or models. So if you see here inside domain, I have role, created the new role class and given it the column names. ID name is deleted and the table name TBL roles, where ID is the primary key. Same thing for permission. We have ID name and TBL permissions. And also in the repositories. So if I go to user repositories, so if I go to application interface and iUser repository, so if I check here now, I have created a method called get user permissions. So we'll what it will do is we'll pass the user to it, and it will get us all the list of permissions which are associated to the user. And the way we've implemented that is, so let's go to user repository, taking a bit of time to publish the database. So let's go to user repositories. So here we have implemented the method of get user permissions. So pass in the user, we take in the user ID, and then we run stored procedure. So we've created a new stored procedure called sp get user permissions. So if I go to that particular stored procedure, okay, so here's the stored procedure. So if you see, so what it does is it takes in the user ID and it does a join between the TBL permissions table, roles table, TBL role permissions mapping table, TBL user roles mapping table, and TBL user details table, and then finds the distinct permission which is associated to the user. So that is because a particular user can belong to multiple roles. He can belong to user role, he can belong to admin role, and every role can have different permissions. So in case uh, two roles have common permission levels, uh, that's the reason we have used a distinct here, so that we get distinct permissions which are allowed for the user based on the highest level of role it belongs to. Okay, so this is the stored procedure for that. Okay, so now the database is published. So let's have a look at the database. So if you see, we have published the database again. So we don't have any user and TBL user roles. We'll do that after the registration. So once we register, an entry will be created in the TBL user details. And then what we'll do is we'll manually assign a role to that particular user. And now if you see this, we have the 3 roles: admin, user, visitor. Then we have 5 permissions: write, modify, list, delete, and read. And then we have the role permission mapping table. wherein the admin role is given all 5 permissions. The user role is given 3 permissions, which is read, list, and modify. And finally, the visitor role, which has minimum permissions, that is just a read permission. Okay, so let's go ahead and move further. So what we'll be doing is uh, we'll be creating an enum first. So let's go to domain, and under common, I'll create a folder called enum. New folder called nums. Okay, and we'll create an enum called permission. Add class permission. And we'll have all the permissions which are there in the database as the enum. So we have these permissions. So this will be one manual step which you need to do. So if you have permissions in your database, so you'll have to have the enum with these permissions. So we have the permissions created here. Okay, so we have this enum with read, list, write, modify, and delete. Okay, so once this is done, the next thing what we'll do is we will create an attribute. So let's head to the infrastructure layer. So we come to infrastructure layer, and let's create another folder called common and utilities. Let's add new folder called common, and inside that we'll add another folder called utilities. And we'll create a class called has permission. So we'll create an attribute, basically. We'll call it has permission attribute. Has permission attribute. Okay. So now what this will take, so let's call it public field has permission. So let's inherit from the authorize attribute. Authorize attribute. Okay, and let's give it a constructor and take in the permission. So we'll use the enum which we have created. Permission, and what we'll do is we'll just call the base constructor and call it as a policy. We'll pass the policy attribute and we'll convert it to string and pass in this permission. Okay. So this will call something called as an authorization policy. For that, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll create a permission authorization policy provider. Okay. So let's go to authentication and I'll create a class called permission authorization policy provider. So what we are doing is we are creating a policy provider for our authorization that is based on the permission. So I'll call it as permission authorization policy provider. what this will do is this will inherit from the default authorization policy provider. So let's inherit from the default authorization policy provider, which belongs to the Microsoft ASP.NET Core.authorization namespace. Let's call this public and try to implement the stack class. So what we'll do is we'll override. Let's try to generate the constructor, and then we'll override the get policy async method. Override get policy async. Add async task. Okay. So here, what we'll do is we'll first get the policy. Say await base.get policy async policy name. So this is what we'll be passing to the attribute. So if you see here, we are passing the policy, and that will be the permission, which is from one of our enum values. So whatever permission we pass, and then after this, what we'll do is we'll check if the policy is not null. If the policy is not null, we'll return this. If it is null, if the policy is null, then we'll create a new policy, return new authorization policy builder. So we'll use this class called authorization policy builder. And then we'll add our permission requirement. So we'll just chain it to dot add requirements. If you see now, this is expecting an argument of type authorization requirement. So let's go ahead and create that. We'll create another class. We'll call it as permission requirement. Permission requirement. And this class will be inheriting authorization requirement. Let's call it public class permission requirement inherits from authorization requirement. And here what I'll do is I'll create a constructor and take in the permission. And I'll also have a field for or a property for permissions. So now we come back to permission authorization policy provider, and the requirement which we have created is new permission requirement, and we pass in the policy name. Okay, and finally we call it, we chain the build method dot build. Okay, so this is ready now. Now what is still pending is we need to do a dependency injection for those. So what we'll first do is we'll add a singleton for the policy provider. We'll come to dependency injections, and just below JWT, what we'll do is we'll just say services dot add authorization. We need to set this add authorization, and then after that what we'll do is we'll add a singleton for authorization policy provider, and we'll put the permission authorization policy provider which we have just created. Okay, so once that's done, we have one more thing which is pending, which is we need to create the handler. So we need to create the authorization handler. Also, another thing is instead of just putting it in authentication, what we'll do is let's create another folder called authorization. Authorization, so that we structure it properly. And instead of putting it in the authentication folder, let's move this to authorization. Also, the permission requirement, I'll move to authorization. So if we check the policy provider and the permission requirement, so we moved it to authorization. Okay. So now what we'll do is we need to create the permission authorization handler. So let's go ahead and add it to the authorization folder. We'll call it permission authorization handler, which will inherit from the authorization handler. In this public, let's inherit from authorization handler, which belongs to generic type, which belongs to Microsoft ASP.NET Core authorization. And the generic type we'll pass in is permission requirement, which we have just created. And then we'll implement the interface, or we'll implement the abstract override the method, which is handle requirement async. Okay. Now here what we'll do is, so the way we'll use it is we'll go to the controller, and now we have the company's endpoint here. So for this, what we'll do is we'll add a new attribute which we have, that is has permission, and to that we'll pass in the type of permission we are allowing the access for this particular endpoint. So only user having permission dot list or permission dot list should be allowed for this. Okay. Only person with the permission of list should be allowed to get the data from this endpoint. Let's remove this from here and just put it as using organization dot, yeah. Okay. So this is the way we add it. Now we have created the has permission attribute, and we are passing in the permission. So this is how we use it against either the endpoints. So we can give fine-grained permissions to each endpoint, as well as the controller. We can have a higher level permission on the controller, and then more fine-grained permissions given to the endpoint. So the permission we have given to get companies is permission.list. Okay. And now what this particular method will be called every time the endpoint is called. So there are two ways of doing it. One way is from the context, we can just take the user ID from the claims, and then using the user ID, we can call the get permissions by user method, which we have created, and get those permissions. and check there. But what that will do is every time the endpoint is called, there will be a database call made. So it might slightly reduce the performance. So we have another approach there. So in that case, what we'll do is when we are generating the token, we'll read the permissions from the user and add the permissions to the claim. Okay, so we'll do that here. So we go to generate access token. Let's go to generate access token method. So here what we'll do is we'll call this as async task string async task string and generate access token. We'll just say just await it here so that this error goes. And now what we'll first do is we'll read the permissions based on the user. Here what we'll do is for each where permission in let's take in let's go unit of work dot users dot get permissions by user. This is the method which we have created and we pass in a user to it. Okay, let's await it here. So we take in the permission and then to claims list which we have, we add new claim. That is all the permissions which the user has, we'll add them as claims in the token. So we'll say new claim, and then we give claim name. So we'll call it permission, and we'll add the permission there. Permission, so it's a string dot name. Yeah, so permission name. So this is the way we add the claim. So we'll add permission claims to that particular access token. So instead of giving the hard-coded string here, what we'll do is we'll use the global constants which we have already created. Utilities global constants, and we'll create new class called custom claims there so that we can use. So we'll go to application, utilities global constants, and we'll create another class called custom claims, and then let's use it here or token service. So instead of this, we'll use global constants dot custom claims dot permission. Okay. So now we've added the claim. So in this case, what will happen is the database call will be made while generating the token. So now since the token will have the permission claims associated to this user, now we go back to the permissions handler. Here, we'll just pull the permissions from the claims instead of making calls to the database. So it will be much faster. So what we do is we Find the permissions. For that, we'll take in context dot user dot claims, user claims dot where claim such that claim dot type claim dot type is equal to. So what is the claim type which we have added? We have added a custom claim type, which is permission. So if we just go to our type, so the claim type we've added is permissions claim type. So we'll use that. So we'll use global constants dot custom claims dot permissions. So we'll find the claims which are of type permissions and then select the value of the claims dot select claim such that claim dot value. Okay. Now we have the permissions. Now finally what we do is we check if permissions dot contains requirement, that is the permission requirement. So whatever permission requirement which is coming in from the has permission attribute which is passed to that particular endpoint, it checks if that permission is available to the user dot permission. If it is available, then it will just mark the request as succeeded. So it'll say context dot succeed requirement. So that means this particular request is authorized. And finally, since it needs to return a task, we'll say return task dot completed. Okay, so we'll put a breakpoint here now. And one more thing which is pending is we need to make a dependency injection entry for the handler. So let's do that. We'll add a singleton. So authorization handler and permission authorization handler. Now we are good to go. Let's check the database. So we still have the user to be registered and the user roles to be created. And if we go to companies controller, we have the permission list which is available there. So let's run our API now. API. Yeah. So let's first go ahead and register the user. So again, we call it John, email john.doe@myorg.com. Yeah, @1234. So once the user is created, let's go to the database and check the entry. So we have a user created. So let's go ahead and assign a role to that user. So we have the user roles mapping table. So we'll take the visitor role, and so this is, I'm making a manual insert there, and I'll take the user ID and put it here, and we'll insert the entry here. So now if we check, the user John has the visitor role. Okay, and if we check the permissions and roles, so if we see the visitor role, which is ij2, you see ij2 has this particular permission, which is read. So it just has read permissions. And the permission which we have given the company's endpoint is the list permission. So technically we should not be able to access this and we should get 403 forbidden. So let's check what's happening. And we have put a breakpoint. So we'll put a breakpoint in generate access token so that we see what claims are added, and we'll also put a breakpoint in the permission handle requirement async. Okay. So now let's go ahead and without authentication, run the company's endpoint first, and let's see what happens. So it comes here and it first throws 401 because we are not at all authenticated. So now let's go ahead and log in first. So we log in as john.doe at myorg.com, India@1234. So now we have hit the generate access token endpoint. So let's go ahead and now if you see it has run a stored procedure and it is getting the permissions. So let's check. So it has got the read permission. And so that's how we know that the user just has one permission because we have given the visitor role to that particular user. We just have read permission. So now let's continue. So if you see now, the token is generated. Let's go ahead and put the token in JWT IO and check the payload. The payload now contains. If you check now, we have another claim called permissions, which has the read permission there. So now we'll go ahead and authorize the user. Bearer, we add the authorized token. And now we'll go to companies and try it out. So when we try to execute it, the handle permission requirement async method is hit. So if we come here, so we have one permission, which is read, but does it contain in here? No. So if you see, the request is not successful, and that's the reason we'll get 403, which is forbidden. So now to make it work, what we can do is, so we'll, what we can do is we'll add the user to another role. Let's say we add the user. So currently the user is present in visitor role. Let's add him to another role called user role, since the user role has read, list, and modify permissions. So we'll add it to the user role. So we'll create the entry here. Now let's check. If you see, it belongs to two roles now. The user is belonging to two roles, that is the user role and visitor role. And if you see, the user role has list permission as well. So now let's see. So before that, another thing I'll be telling you is we'll need to log in again because the existing access token won't have the updated claim. So if it happens so that the user is already logged in a session and from the admin side, somebody tends to change the roles of that user, for the new claims to work, the person needs to get a new access token. So either has to wait for the expiry time of the access token, or has to refresh the token. Then only the user will get the new claims. So what we'll do is we'll log out. We'll try to log in again so that we get the new token. So let's log in again to get the new token. So now if you see, again hit the breakpoint, now it's adding the claims, and now you see it has multiple claims based on the new role which we have added. So now we'll take in this new token and we'll just place it here. And now if you see the permissions, it has new permissions. It has modify, list, and read permission. Now let's go ahead and put this token here. We call it bearer. Paste it here. And now if we run the company's endpoint and check here, so the list of permission which has is 3 permissions. And now if you see, it is successful because the endpoint is accessible to us and you get the data. Okay. So this was about permission authorization, where we add permission to the claims. One more thing I would like to tell you is about shortcomings of this approach. There are two shortcomings of this approach. That is, if there are too many permissions, what can happen is the size of the access token can be large, which can again cause a slight permission issue, slight performance issues. That is only if there are large number of permissions in the access token. And the other issue is if the user has read permissions initially, and now say suppose the user is logged in and the permissions are updated behind the scenes in settings. To get the new permissions, the user has to log in again to get the new access token, or the token must be refreshed. So this particular method is best used if you have a refresh token. And since we have previously covered the topic of refresh token in the previous tutorial, we are good here because the access token is short-lived. So it should not be that you give your access token a validity of 5 days. So in that case, if a person is having modify and write roles today, and say suppose he's logged in and now you change the access and just give him read writes, but he'll still have an access token which has claims of higher level permissions, which is not supposed to happen. So that's the reason we use access tokens with refresh tokens, wherein the validity of access token is very less, bare minimum up to an hour, and the refresh token can go up to a week. So we've already handled that situation here. So the only reason of choosing this particular approach is you can use the other approach, wherein in the handle requirement async, instead of getting the permissions from the claims and before passing the permissions to the claims, we can what we can also do is retrieve the user ID of the user from the claims and then make a database call to get the permissions in this method. But the only thing is, since this is called every time, it will have to make a call to the database every time and every endpoint is hit. So that's the reason we use the other approach. So that's it from me from this tutorial. Thank you.